time series is a new data type you can now submit directly from your instruments, download into a template, and load it into EIM. We have a different way of storing that data in our database, and it becomes searchable, and we also have some charting capabilities from our search application for visualizing it. It also becomes downloadable as either the individual measurements themselves or as summary data, as Kristen alluded to earlier, where we calculate on the fly the daily maximum, minimum values, daily averages, I think also 7-day average rolling averages for daily average maximums as well. So first I will show you the template. And one thing that's important to note is that unlike the discrete results, locations, and water level templates, the time series data template that you download in that zip folder is actually a CSV file. All it is column headings that you have to populate using EIM valid values. This is to, unfortunately, it's not as helpful as the other documents because you can't search a valid value list and you can't run a macro that's going to check your values to that valid value list. But it does accommodate more records to be uploaded directly into EIM, which was our main goal in designing this time series template. Because time series data, there's usually a lot of it collected all at one time. There's some things that you'll need to know before you submit time series data batches within these templates. Currently, let's go look at the template. You're already familiar with most of the fields. There are only 21 fields in this template, unlike the results template. Unfortunately, you can only submit one template for a unique study ID and location ID combination. So if you have 20 locations where you're collecting time series data, you will have to submit 20 templates worth of data submittals for your study. What this does accommodate is, however, multiple instruments to be submitted within one single template. And also, you may have multiple instruments collecting the same parameter, or you may have multiple instruments collecting multiple parameters, or a single instrument collecting multiple parameters. These templates, you can enter those data in. The main thing is that you have one location per template and one study represented in each template. The other thing that is not captured at the template level is the time zone in which the data was collected. Data loggers will sometimes calculate your date times to daylight savings time if it crosses that boundary. Unfortunately, you have to submit your template based on only one time zone. So you can choose either daylight savings time or standard time, but it has to be applicable to all the record values that you're submitting. But aside from that, this is a template where you can copy and paste your data loggers values in as long as there are a few requirements met. And then we have some additional fields that we've already covered mostly in the result template for describing the EIM metadata, to associate that to a location, to associate that to a study ID once it's loaded in. So the fields in this template, like we've seen before, are study ID, location ID, the study-specific location ID, and there's the second one, which is the instrument ID. This will probably be your serial number of whatever your data logger is that you've deployed into the environment. The main thing is that if you're submitting data for two different instruments, please distinguish them using this field. And it doesn't have to be the serial ID. It could be a unique identifier that you use. So you get to create this ID, but you must distinguish two instruments from each other. There are two different field collection types that you can submit within this template: measurement and observation. Of course, there's no time series sample data available, unfortunately. You can't do that. But observations do become a little bit more valuable when you're submitting time series data. And typically with time series data, there are periods of time where you might experience an instrument malfunction, or say if you're submitting data from a thermistor in a stream channel. It may have encountered a dry period it was actually out of water. There are periods of time that often get excluded from time series data sets, and you can represent them as an observation where you excluded data. And I'll show you an example of that later in the time series. But it's essentially another time period where you were unable to measure and get a result value. We have you populate who the field collector was. We also have a place where you can enter in the field collection reference point and a depth for a meter. And again, you can submit multiple depths within the same template as long as it's for one location ID. Sometimes people will deploy nested thermistors at different water levels, depth in a well. And this is a way to accommodate that. If you fill any one of these three fields out, you'll have to fill them all out so that we know what the depth and units and reference point associated with that depth is. Matrix and source are other fields that we need you to populate. And again, this is the standard value list from the result template where you can get this information. We have two fields, start date and start time. This is your measurement date and time where the value was obtained, when the value was obtained. And these are broken out into two fields. I know a lot of data loggers will export this out as a single field. We'll have a submittal guidelines document for this that has a little tip for how to split those out for people that aren't familiar with dealing with that aspect of Excel. The end date and time are exclusively for anything that's an observation so that you can report the start and end of a time period where data wasn't collected that you want to represent. We have the parameter that's being collected, and again, this is a valid value list from EIM, so as long as it's a valid value for your instrument, you can enter it in here. Column Q is the result value, and so this is the result value straight from your data logger, and then this is the EIM data valid value for the result units of measure. We also have fields for applying a result data qualifier to the individual measurements themselves, so that we know if there was an issue, and maybe you may have days where some of the values were estimated. You can enter in that estimation using the measurement result data qualifiers from our valid value list. So ask for the method by which you're collecting the measurement, and we also have the ability to assign a comment to any individual record. In this example template, I've just mocked up a period that would most likely not be submitted to EIM, where a logger that was deployed in a stream was actually measuring water values because it hadn't been deployed yet. In this case, I've just rejected them all and added a comment for example purposes. And if we have time and we can go into the submittal, we'll see how this can be looked at when you submit your data as well. First, I just want to go down to the observation examples that I've entered into this template to show you how you would apply those fields. Again, it's the parameter name of unable to measure, and you would not submit a result value or result units of measure. And you would need to associate a start and end time that you want to comment on and describe what your unable to measure period represents. There are also result data qualifiers for observations that can be used instead of comments in some cases when something generic happens. And you can look through those valid values to find out what those may be. And that is the extent of populating this template. As you can probably tell, there's just a lot of copying and pasting down through an entire data set that you can do, and then adding in your logger's result value. That's it. Are there any questions?
And then, so for uploading, this does not get exported to XML?
No, it does not. That's the question was whether or not this template gets exported as XML when you're loading this data. No, we keep it in the CSV format. So when you've populated this template, there's a naming convention where you're going to have to create a unique name for each template that you fill out, but you'll leave it in the CSV format and upload that exact CSV file, so you don't have to go through an export process. We've incorporated all of the data checks into the data loading process, so hopefully we'll get a chance to show you that. There's a question of whether or not it's worth mentioning which data we should be entering. Truly, if your matrix and source where you are intending to represent a measurement isn't true because your data logger was in a truck and it wasn't actually measuring fresh water, certainly you'd really consider not submitting that data. We do not need that.
We don't have a sample source of truck error.
Yeah, truck error is not one of those sample sources,
Yeah.
despite all of our best efforts to give you usable values. So yeah, if it's truly not the measure of the parameter or the matrix source that you're providing, strongly consider not including that data at all. And you probably don't even need to mention it in the observation.